Okay. Hi, my name's Jeff Mercer. I'm Deputy Chief Librarian of South Shore Public Libraries, and I have the privilege to talk to author Christine Welldon about her new book, Kid Sterling. And so she's an author of multiple nonfiction books, and we're going to talk about this particular book really soon. But I'm going to get Christine, just introduce yourself. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Yes, I've written 11 books of nonfiction. This is a departure for me. I was asked to do a nonfiction book about the history of jazz for children in Canada, and I found that that genre wasn't suitable for this topic. I think jazz is a very subtle, has very subtle complexities and layers of richness and vibrancy, and the best genre for this would be a novel. And so I determined to write a novel about the beginnings of jazz. I discovered Buddy Bolden, who was the inventor of jazz, and I had to create a protagonist who would connect with Buddy and his world in New Orleans at the time of the beginning of the jazz age in 1906.
Okay, and that leads right into what I wanted to ask first was why the switch from nonfiction to fiction, but more importantly, maybe because we know why now, what were the new challenges in changing that genre?
The challenges were very many. I had to know the environment in New Orleans at that time, so that meant learning, if I were to walk down the street, thoroughly immersing myself in the sights and sounds of the city. What would be underfoot? Would it be a paved road? Would it be a dirt road? Did people use ballpoint pens? Trivial things like this that I had to learn to make my story as authentic as I possibly could. Also, writing from a different race and culture, I had to be very careful and respectful of the humanity of my characters. So it was quite a challenge.
Yeah, yeah. And for me, what I find interesting, so this is historical fiction. So you're weaving some real people in with your invented characters. So what intrigued you about sort of taking that direction for your first novel? Not just for the subject matter, but you're going from nonfiction to fiction. Now you're like, you know what, I'll take real people as well as my own characters. How did that come about?
Yes, I found it very easy, much easier to have that framework of the historical characters because I could learn everything that was true about them and authentic about them, and then to take my story in and around those characters and illustrate their talents and skills in that era. It was also the Jim Crow era was a very restrictive period in the history of the African Americans at the turn of the century. So I was a little bit afraid I had to bring that in, even though I was a bit nervous about portraying that. The Jim Crow era subjugated the African Americans to some very brutal situations. And also the mafia was prevalent in New Orleans at that time, and they controlled the shipping and the fruit and vegetable shipments and the cocaine market. And so all of these shady, gritty elements, I needed my character to be able to interact and deal with all of the struggles that he encounters along the way.
Well, so that actually brings me to something I was going to ask. I'm going to bounce around my questions a little bit, but a lot happens to young Sterling, your protagonist in this story, and some's good and some is bad, but there are several scenes of racism and subjugation. And so I just wanted to ask, because I think you did a great job in depicting these seriously and not treating them lightly, but they're not graphic, and yet they can be very scary. There's one scene I can think of in Plaquemine in particular. It's pretty frightening. That's really, really awful. And so how are you able to sort of treat it with the respect and seriousness that you need to, especially given the audience you're writing for? And also, what does it tell us about Sterling's world and how he's trying to make his way?
I didn't want to show any direct violence. I wanted to be more careful in the way I approached it. So there is a suggestion always of violence. Sterling learns about lynchings secondhand. He doesn't actually encounter a lynching. I didn't want it to be too frightening, but I wanted to build up that suspense. Mm-hmm. And I did that by not actually having him be threatened or, threatened with lynching or a beating, but to have that in, looming ominously in the background to convey that climate of fear that the African American children and of course the adults went through during that period of Jim Crow.
Well, I think you did a good job. I could feel it. I mean, it just was just there, like you say, under the surface. Not everything that all the characters did, but a lot of what they were doing, that was, you could tell it's in the back of their mind, and they're always kind of wary about, making sure, not to put a toe out of line or something like that. So just to lighten it up a bit then. But Sterling Crawford, a young boy in New Orleans, and he's 10 when we start the story, right? So that's pretty young. It's the birth of jazz. The city's just kind of really turning into what we think of as New Orleans now, I think. And he idolizes local musician Buddy Bolden, as you said. So not someone I knew anything about. So I'm intrigued as to why you chose Buddy as Sterling's idol, and then especially because I looked up Buddy afterwards, and you had some in the book a little bit about him, and that's a tragic story at the end of it. So why Buddy?
Well, the first and most important reason is that Buddy was the inventor of the jazz style of music. He was, we know very little about him, but what we do know that he could not read music, and he couldn't write music notation, but he had a very fine ear, and he could hear a song once and kind of change it up. So he would take a gospel tune and change it into the blues, and he'd do a fusion of marching band and ragtime, change the beat. It was later called the Big Four, where there was a syncopation in the beat and the rhythm, and that allowed eventually for improvisation, which was, the foundation of jazz, the development of jazz. So he was a tragic figure, but he did have his moment of glory. He was considered to be, in our terms, he would be a rock star, and he was called King Bolden. He was music royalty, and no one has ever heard, since his death, no one has ever heard him play. There was a recording of his playing. There was one recording made in the late 1800s of his band, and it was on a wax cylinder, and it's been lost to time. And so if you were to ask for a recording of Buddy Bolden, of course, there is no such thing. But it is rumored to have existed at some point and just got lost in somebody's collection. Somebody mentioned a warehouse fire that was burned down. So we don't know very little. Don't know very much about him, but we do know that he was a gifted musician. He was a genius, and he had the talent and the skill that he could take music to a different level that no one had ever heard before. Crowds would flock to him and to hear him play, and the women would scream, and he'd be strutting around the stage and acting just like a rock star. And so his demise was very, very tragic. He succumbed to alcoholism, and he had schizophrenia, and he was sent to an insane asylum at the age of mid-30s, and he was there for 20 years and died in obscurity. By that time, the people of New Orleans had forgotten about him, and he buried in a pauper's grave. But today he's been revived. There is his old house is still there, and there's a committee who are trying to keep it safe and conserve it for future generations. So he is not recognized today, whereas he was totally obscure when he lost his fame back then.
Wow. Well, and you're doing just a small bit in helping that legacy continue in here. He's quite the character, I have to say, and what I found amazing, and it ties into Sterling and what he does sort of at the beginning of the book in particular. So he and his friends are just running the streets. I mean, they are going to school sometimes, but they're on their own a lot. They're working or they're playing in their own band. I mean, the king pulls him up on stage. He just happens to see him, and because he was shining his shoes, and he said, "Yeah, come on up." So, how close to real life at the time was that? These young boys just kind of really doing their own thing most of the time.
Yeah, it was quite common actually. Children, boys and girls were put to work. They didn't have a formal education. Usually they would just go straight to work at the age of 7 or 8. Many of them weren't that free to roam the streets, as you mentioned. Sterling's mother is a very careful woman, and she wants him to get a proper education, and so she's quite firm in that. So she makes sure that he's always on the straight and narrow, but that gives him the opportunity to wander around at will and he'll listen for Bolden's music. Apparently, Bolden's music could be heard all around the city, and so Sterling would be able to hear that sound, follow it to the source, and sit outside and listen. As a matter of fact, Louis Armstrong, when he was a kid of 8 or 9, he used to do the same thing. He was quite captivated by Bolden's sound, and he would do exactly that. He'd go around trying to find where he was playing next, and really entranced by his style of playing. So a lot of the children of that era were sent to work in the cotton mills and mines, and there were no safety precautions or regulations, and many of the children, of course, were injured, and sadly some of them did die.
Yeah.
So it was a tough life for children.
Yeah, well, and you touched on a lot of that. I mean, one of his friends has an accident that doesn't turn out so well. Yeah, it's in many ways it's a pretty heavy story, but the characters go through it, and there's a sense of optimism, almost not all the time, but most of the time, right? Like they're very sort of looking forward. They're not getting down.
Yeah,
Even
I chose Sterling for that reason, because he's that age, 8, 9, 10, where anything is possible, that you dare to dream anything, and you can visually see the goal ahead, and you don't see the setbacks that might occur and the roadblocks along the way. You just see that goal and you go for it at that age. So that was a good age for him to be.
Yeah, and I really liked his relationship with his brother too. I'm the older brother in my family, so it didn't, but it felt like a very real brotherly relation. Like I get it, there's that sort of love, and yet that inter-family kind of squabbling, and and the age difference is enough that they don't quite get each other anymore. Tell us a bit more about Syl, because he's going a little bit of a different path.
Yes, Syl, his brother, is around 17, and he's addicted to gambling, and he does have dealings with the mafia. I don't want to give too much away, but what I wanted to show with the brother, who acts as a foil to what Sterling's trying to do with his life, is to show that love can be or should be unconditional, and this is a life lesson that Sterling learns along his journey, that even though his brother has put him into some really brutal situations, he's still able to love his brother and to have hope for them to be friends in the future.
Yeah. So I have a couple of things I want to ask you about that sort of really set the setting. Let's start with the obvious, which is jazz. And this is in the infancy of jazz, as you said. So is jazz like one of your favorites in terms of?
Oh, absolutely. I think jazz has the power to connect us all. It's a language that we can all understand. My favorite jazz artists would be in the really early beginnings in the 30s and 40s, when especially John Coltrane, who wrote really transformative compositions, and Miles Davis. And when I needed to go to New Orleans to hear this music in person, and so I asked Canada Council to fund me, and they did. They read the manuscript and they sent me down there, and I was able to access the Hogan Jazz Archives. It's the finest archive in the world relating to the history of jazz, and I was able to hear the voices of the musicians, the recordings, their letters, and out-of-print biographies and autobiographies, and get a good idea of how they spoke and what their characters were like. And it was really a joy to go there, and of course, being in the city in person, hearing all of those sounds and the flavors and the colors and the fragrances of the city, and poring over old city maps to make sure that I got the street names correct, because street names have changed quite remarkably since that time. Yes, so the whole experience was just amazing for me to actually see it in action and hear all the different kinds of music and the influences, you know, the Western African rhythms and the Cajun and the Creole and the foods, and all blended together. It was quite the experience.
Well, and that just leads me to the other thing, because you really do paint a portrait of a city. Like, it feels real. You know, obviously I haven't been there in 1906, but it felt like a real living place. And part of it was the music and the lifestyle that you're depicting. But part of it, and you just touched on it, you know, there's several different dialects or way of speaking.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so I was just interested, because, so like, did you invent those, or is that some real speech patterns?
No, I wouldn't dare invent. The African American dialect has its rules of grammar, and there, for example, there are in formal English there are 4 present tenses. In African American dialect there are 5 present tenses, and so I had to learn all the rules. There's tons and tons of rules for the African American dialect. I had to learn how to speak. So I ran it by a couple of African American linguists at a couple of universities in the US, and they coached me, and thank God they did, because I would have hated to get it wrong, and they helped me with my dialogue throughout the book. So yes, and I think I must have given my editor a few headaches because of all the drop commas and and the different spellings and different grammatical constructions, which an editor would want to correct, but no, you can't correct it. This is the African American dialect that I've used.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and it was interesting because you would hear that, and then, you know, his teacher had a different way of speaking, and a couple of other characters, you know, had their ways, and it was dependent. It almost seemed like it was neighborhood dependent in some ways.
Oh, I'm glad that you got that in.
Yeah, it was pretty fascinating. Yeah, it was really, really interesting. It really felt like a real place that I.
Yes, it took 3 years to do the research and the writing, and I found when I'm writing fiction, when I'm not writing the story, I'm away from the computer, I'm thinking about the characters. So they occupied my mind for 3 years. And when I the last page, I felt quite sad to leave them, because here they're gone now. I've finished the story. It's all over, and they're no longer with me. So it's a little bit sad to go through. Never ever have I felt sad to finish a book when I'm writing nonfiction as I did writing this novel. So it was quite an experience, quite a journey.
I'm not surprised, because I want to know what's next for young Sterling, and maybe we'll never know.
I'm glad you want to know what happens to Sterling. I'm going to take, my next story is going to go into the world of Montreal in the 20s. And this is after the Great Migration, or during and after the Great Migration of the African Americans who wanted to come north to freedom and to Chicago and beyond. And so many of them did come to Montreal, and I'm going to set my story there. And this time it will be a female protagonist, and Sterling is going to come into the story halfway through. So I'm having my story based in Montreal now, and I wanted to bring a more Canadian flavor to it as well.
I think that's fantastic. I'm excited. Well, I just wanted to say I really enjoyed this book. You know, it's got a quick pace, but there's a lot of action and detail and character depth to it. So even though you can read it quickly, it's not something you're just breezing through. Like, there's a lot to take in. I think it's fantastic. I'm going to give everyone another shot of the cover here, which I think is great. And so who are we looking at the cover, or do I just have to guess?
It's an impression of the jazz artist, very likely Buddy Bolden himself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah.
I love the colors, and it's a very vibrant cover, and I'm very happy with the way they portrayed Buddy Bolden on that cover.
Yeah. Well, congratulations, Christine. This book's fantastic. I recommend Kid Sterling to everyone. Is the sequel the next one we're going to see from you, or do you have something else in the works first?
I actually am just finishing. I'm just finishing a novel about. I really like writing novels now. I'm not going to go back to nonfiction, I don't think. I'm writing a novel halfway through about a kid who rides the rails during the Great Depression across the prairies, across Canada. So that's the next one, and that's coming. That will be finished. I don't know when it's coming out, but it will be finished within the next 3 months. And then I'll turn my mind to my Montreal story.
Great. Wow.
Yeah, thank you also for helping me launch this book, because with the current situation, actual launches and book tours and interviews are not possible. So I'm really grateful to you, Jeff, for giving me this opportunity to launch Kid Sterling. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. It's a little odd that we're doing this in two completely different places, but we can still connect. We can still get the word out. I'm very happy to help you with that.
Thank you, Jeff.
Okay.
Take care.
Well, we will talk soon. And again, everyone, grab a copy of Kid Sterling and you won't regret it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.